we see one small step on Mars. Microsoft is proud to sponsor NOVA for celebrating the potential in us all.
And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
The desolate wastes of the Taklamakan Desert, at the heart of Central Asia, are haunted by an ancient mystery. It was here long ago that East and West, two of the greatest civilizations on Earth, made imperceptible contact. And here that faint traces of ancient life have long pressed a deep and vexing enigma. Did the civilization of ancient China arise in isolation? Or was there an unremembered link with the cultures of the West? Now the echoes of voices long silent are offering startling testimony. Like other detective stories, this one begins with a dead body. This woman and others like her are as old as 3,800 years, yet remarkably well preserved. More startling yet, the mummies are clearly not Chinese, but they may provide evidence to solve the riddle of ancient China's interaction with the West. An expedition is now setting out into the Taklamakan, headed far across the dunes and deep into a long-lost past. The quest to reclaim the mummy people's story began when Chinese scholar Victor Mayer virtually stumbled on the most important find of his career.
In 1987, I went into the museum in Urumqi and walked into this room that was full of mummies, and I couldn't believe what I saw. The label said that they dated back to 1000 BC. They looked as fresh as though they had just been exhumed a week or two ago. From that moment forward, I was totally enchanted with the mummies.
Also here is archaeologist Janine Davis Kimball, who specializes in ancient nomadic peoples. Charlotte Roberts, forensic anthropologist, will be helping to decipher the ancient remains. The mummies are rarely made available for outside scrutiny. But the Chinese archaeologist who found this woman lying exposed on the desert sands allows the team to see her.
This corpse was found on the surface, close to the surface of Tomb 2. According to Mr. He, it was partially dismembered and was a sacrificial victim for the main occupant of the tomb. He believes that this person was from another tribe and that it was sacrificed in respect for the main occupant of the tomb. Her eyes have been gouged out. She's lacking her arms beneath the elbow joints, and from the pelvis down below, there's nothing remaining.
Can we actually look at the pelvis? So there are no leg bones at all?
No leg bones at all.
Yeah.
They've been jerked out or yanked out, according to Mr. He.
Oh, looking at the pelvis, she's quite young, actually. If you look at the surface here, you see a ridge and furrow pattern, which is characteristic of a young person. Yeah. So there were no leg bones at all?
No.
It is a fascinating yet oddly intimate encounter with a woman who lived and suffered more than 3,000 years ago. More chilling yet is the fate of an infant child found buried below the woman on the surface.
Charlotte, how old would you say this child is?
Well, I can just see the incisor teeth in the lower jaw. This would indicate a person about the age of 1 year, but could be as young as 8 months or as old as 16 months.
This little baby boy was found in a hole over the main occupant of the grave. His head was inserted head first, and his feet were sticking up. So according to Mr. He, he was buried alive, and that he's howling, he's screaming. Also, Mr. He says that there are traces of mucus coming out of his nostrils and traces of tears. So according to Mr. He, this child was sacrificed again for the priestess.
可以看看这个里面。
Oh, I can see that.
Little
there.
hand clenched.
Oh, beautiful.
The visitor's attention is drawn to the fabric wrapping the tiny body. It was not made by the Chinese, who hadn't yet acquired the craft of weaving wool with such sophistication. Where did the little boy come from?
And very fair-haired too.
Almost reddish.
If you actually look at the profile, the nose is quite large and long.
Long nose.
Yeah, although at this age we wouldn't really want to say much about ethnic affiliation.
There is no uncertainty about the ethnic origins of the body buried in the main chamber, below the other two. This perfectly preserved mummy was a woman of about 40.
从人种来讲，它是属于欧罗巴人种。
It's a European type of person.
是属于欧罗巴人种，所以她的身比较高。
So she's quite tall. She's 1.72 meters.
这个屁股也很高。
Her nose is very high.
These mummies were not embalmed. Their amazing preservation is due to the dryness and salinity of the desert soil.
This is the mistress or the lady of the main occupant of the tomb.
我估计啊，就是在部落打时候，那个青年妇女和小孩是被他的人抓住以后为他殉葬的。
He thinks that there was a war and that these other sacrificed victims were captured in the war, and then out of respect for her, they were buried with her. From this cemetery, there have been 17 desiccated corpses found, all in quite good state of preservation. But the most beautiful one is this in our museum.
第一次看到她，当我把她从墓葬里抱出来的时候，我就发现她是世界上最漂亮的一个女人。
When I brought her out of the grave and held her in my arms, I realized that she was the most beautiful woman on earth.
我抱了一个很漂亮的女人。
I was startled. I was holding the most beautiful woman on earth.
就是如果我就说她是现在活着的话，或者我自己到3000年以前的话，我一定娶她。
If she were alive today, or if I were alive 3,000 years ago, I would certainly make her my wife.
But how could a Chinese man like Mr. He have met a blonde woman 3,000 years ago? According to many scholars and predominant Chinese belief, China's civilization was essentially evolving in isolation from the West. Though it concerns a distant past, the question resonates in the present. Most of the people who dwell in China's westernmost regions don't look especially Chinese. Many of these people, known as Uyghurs, don't think of themselves as Chinese either. In recent years, some have called for autonomy from China, and to them, the mummies are proof that their ancestors were an ethnically distinct group, here long before the arrival of Chinese conquerors. As a result, the question of the mummy's ethnic identity is a sensitive matter. No one disputes that eventually China's isolation was broken, and a lively traffic in commerce and culture flowed between East and West. To this day, weathered beacon towers rise from the arid wastes, drawing the traveler's eye to the path of the fabled Silk Road. Beaten into the land by traders' caravans and conquering legions about 2,000 years ago, it was the interstate highway of the ancient world. A bustling corridor where disparate cultures rubbed elbows and exchanged precious goods and ideas. The Silk Road, 4,000 miles long, spanned the entire world as the ancients knew it. At one end, the great civilizations of Rome and Greece. From there, the route made its way across the Near East and through the untamed Russian steppes. Those who survived the brutal winds and marauding pirates went on to confront forbidding mountains and white-hot dunes. Crossing the Taklamakan Desert was the final ordeal, leading at last to China's frontier. Tales of the grueling trip have surely lent credence to the view that ancient China was beyond the reach of Western influence. Over the centuries, the Silk Road sprouted a civilization of its own. It was as fantastically long as it was oddly narrow, lined with imposing temples and thriving cities. It was thought that these structures were built by the Chinese, but it now seems that the architects were a little-known local people known as the Tocharians, who seem to have appeared in these parts over 2,000 years ago. Some of their cities were located remarkably close to the ancient mummy graveyards in the Taklamakan, suggesting that this mysterious tribe may be connected to the mummy people. To explore this idea, the team has asked its Chinese hosts to take them to a mummy burial site. Since the whole issue of the mummies is laden with political stakes, they are constantly accompanied by 2 Chinese officials. The cemetery outside the oasis village of Wupu has already yielded many mummies. Jacob Satuhola, Regional Director of Archaeology, extends a warm welcome. Then he explains that even though the central government has forbidden any more mummy excavations, he will make an exception. In the interest of international cooperation, he allows them to dig up a grave. Only about 1 grave in 6 actually contains a mummy at this site, and many of the graves have been disturbed by grave robbers. Victor senses this one has not been spared.
There's no question in my mind that the grave had been disturbed. The timbers covering the roof of the grave were inverted from their normal position. There were no reeds or branches or other materials to cover over the grave that would prevent the sand from falling down into the chamber.
The grave goods should be down at the level that the back or the side is. The lowest point is where the grave goods should be. We're not quite down to that point yet. I can't tell what this is over here, Charlotte. Can you tell in this corner here? Is that a pelvis or is it...
There's been some disturbance in the barrel.
It's been disturbed, right.
There's something else coming out there as he's brushing.
Normally we would see the skull or the head before we see the chest because the head is higher, thicker, and we would see that. And so far we've seen a chest and a hand that I've seen. Charlotte may
and a
see
bit of a forearm. and part of a leg. But that's about all we can see at the moment.
This is a piece of textile, but it's not a woven piece. It's done in a different technique that's sort of like a braid. And it probably was a piece of, like a piece of belting used on some part of their clothing. It feels like wool. Oh, yeah, this is wool that's been spun. Sheep wool, spun into yarn. And let's see, is it woven? No, there's no weaving on it yet. It's just twisted.
For a moment, a scrap of wool distracts the visitors. But Victor suspects something is amiss.
Peering down into the grave, I saw fungal growth on the corpse, which would indicate that it had probably previously been located elsewhere than in that grave. And the fact that the corpse itself was quite well preserved, but it was headless, is inexplicable unless there was disturbance.
It seems the Chinese had planted a headless body here to avoid the risk of unearthing a European typeface. They may not have anticipated that the visitors would explore other avenues in their search for clues to the origins of the mummy people. Victor, once again, has unearthed a major find without having to dig at all. In an obscure local museum, he finds two mummies from the cemetery. An adult man and a girl, surrounded by objects from her grave.
She's quite young, and from what I can see, looking at the edge of the pelvis, there's a bit there that usually fuses around the age of 25, and that certainly hasn't fused, so she's probably around 18 to 20 years of age. If you look at her face, she's got a pretty flat face and high cheekbones, a short nose which isn't very protruding. And she looks very similar to people who live in this area today, although we notice she's got an overbite. If you look at the teeth, you see the teeth.
Yeah.
Usually many people in this area have an edge-to-edge bite, and she has got an overbite,
So
which
the
tends to be more European in nature. We've got some preservation of hair here, and look at the fingernails. You see them? They're quite long and don't look like they've been cut for a long time. Interestingly, this young person looks like she's quite emaciated. Now, that might be something to do with the mummification process, desiccating the skin, but maybe she was ill for a long time. But certainly there's no evidence to suggest, by just looking here, what caused her death.
She has very little flesh. Her fingers are very skinny.
Beside the girl is a water bucket.
And then on top of it is a piece of bread. And this whole apparatus, including the halter for the donkey, which lies beside her, indicates that they placed things in the burial for her trip to the next world or to use in the afterworld, which were very important, like the bucket which held a liquid, the bread, and the bridle for transportation.
The male body, which was discovered in the late 70s, is faring far worse than it would buried in sand. The curators lacked the funds to prevent the gradual disintegration of some of the most important human remains ever found. But this ancient man can still offer precious clues about his people. An oval face and reddish hair suggest European roots. His bronze earring and leather boots show his people were skilled artisans.
They were buried wearing their clothing. They wore boots with felt stockings, caftans, trousers. So we know what they would have looked like when they were walking around and alive.
The objects they cherished in death begin to create a picture of the mummy people's lives. They were farmers who kept domestic animals and worked a land thousands of miles away from their ancestral turf.
This is a food item for the local people, and it's made from barley, and they came in many different shapes.
So it's in effect bread?
Bread of some sort. And you'll notice the curvature on this piece of bread.
A wooden basin with legs on the bottom. It's a vessel for daily use.
Yes, it's a vessel for daily use, but it's also placed in the burial and could have held bits of food or intended to hold food for use in their next world also.
Noted archaeologist Wang Bin-he found further evidence.
We even found some farming tools. The woolen and leather clothing came mainly from sheep, so they must have had quite large flocks. Handicrafts were also well developed. For example, they could make clay pots.
This was probably used by the priestess or the shamanka, the female priestess, to cure people. There's still evidence this is very possibly a little cultic cup made from clay, fired very nicely, and it has an extremely thin. When we have this
expanding spiral,
this spiral, right? This is very typical of nomadic people also.
Hard to believe it's 3,200 years old.
Cowrie shells from the sea, not naturally found within thousands of miles of this vast desert, give up a crucial piece of the puzzle.
They must have been engaged in long-distance trade, because we see in their graves sometimes things like cowries. They would have had to acquire such things from distant peoples.
These are actually the spindles, and this is the spindle whorl. This one is made out of wood, while this one is made out of bone. And they're different weights, so they would be used to spin different weights of wool yarn.
Of all the finds here, the woolen textiles are the most impressive. Woven into twill and tartan patterns, these are among the oldest fine woolen clothes ever discovered.
This one has beautiful and harmonious colors. It has blue, white, and red. Also, the design and weaving is so wonderful. This piece is 3,000 years old.
Strikingly similar to Celtic tartans from northwest Europe, the patterns in the weave are like ancient DNA, waiting to be decoded. Are they evidence that the mummy people share common origins with the people of Western Europe? Scientific reconstruction of the heads of the mummies produces a face that strongly resembles ancient Celts and Saxons. The mummy people buried their dead in the barren desert, but lived in the oases along its edges. These islands of green are still home to farmers who have little contact with the outside world and use tools and methods that have barely changed over the centuries. Could their way of life harbor its own living relics? Fragments of an ancient time preserved like the mummies themselves. The team sets out to explore a nearby village. Charlotte wants to find out about patterns of health and nutrition, since those leave indelible marks on corpses and skeletons.
Are there any problems, general health problems? Is there any dental disease?
Problems that afflict present-day locals might explain defects found on the mummies and shed light on their way of life.
Colds and flus and just general minor illnesses, but nothing major. Yeah, no. But you can see, like the one woman, she has a thyroid condition.
Yes, I wondered if there was an iodine deficiency in the water.
It turns out the local people enjoy good health, sustained by a balanced diet of cereals, fruit, vegetables, and meat from their livestock. But the condition of the livestock itself prompts an important insight about the past.
Looking at the animals today, their wool is very, very poor quality,
And in contrast, the textiles that we found in the burials are made from very, very fine quality wool. So that would indicate to me that they had trade with nomadic people who were living in the Tian Shan, who were in an environment that would produce a very fine quality wool.
Today's farmers do in fact buy wool, meat, and timber from herders who live high in the mountains. Could this pattern date back to the mummy people?
I believe that the mummy people must have had similar contact with ancient nomadic herders to weave such fine textiles.
There's a lot about this cart that looks like very ancient remains that we found.
The ways of the living echo those of the past. The mummy people, like the people of the Russian steppes to the north and the west, use donkey carts similar to those found here today.
There's a piece of wood in one of the burials. It's almost identical with these pieces here.
The changeless nature of their design is revealed by these artifacts found in their graves. The mummy people used the wheel long before it was known in China, and may have played a role in introducing it to Chinese civilization. In another reflection of the past, fir trees from the Tian Shan Mountains are used to fashion vessels and boards, like those the local women use for bread making.
When we were working at Wupu at the graveyard, we found a similar bowl, smaller in size, but made with the identical techniques.
Even the curved bread resembles the ancient loaf, similarly baked on the oven wall.
In some ways, when you go into the modern village of Wupu, you feel like you're entering into the ancient period in which when you look at the artifacts, you feel like you're recapitulating that. There's so many similarities.
But the scholars need to set their gaze beyond the village to explore the interdependence of local farmers and mounted nomadic herdsmen. After centuries of self-sufficiency, the mummy people grew increasingly reliant on goods provided by nomads, who found in the higher reaches of the Tian Shan Mountains pastures rich enough to raise high-quality livestock. Until recently, this area was off-limits to foreigners, and the visitors were not prepared for what they saw.
Much to our utter surprise, we found magnificent grasslands that are so immense it boggles the mind, and they go very high. One could not possibly take advantage of this territory without having had a horse. There's no doubt that horseback riding had a great impact upon the expansion and occupation of the territory in this region.
But could horseback riding have reached these parts centuries before it was known in China? Victor's friend, archaeologist Lu Nguyen, is a leading expert on the ancient nomads. His spectacular finds are revealing the nomads were expert riders as early as 800 BC.
The 4th century BC horse saddle that we found doesn't have any metal or wood on it. It's upholstered, as you can see, white leather. It's as far as we know, it's one of the earliest saddles in the world that's so perfectly preserved. We can see that it's been mended here, patched up. It has beautiful bone fittings on the edges to tie the straps on.
And at the back here.
In the bridle and the bit, things like this, we found a lot from those 7th and 6th century Chawahugo burials. Yeah.
The bit at the bottom. I've got the headband up here.
The cheek pieces are wooden sticks. The snaffle bit is made of iron. And we have the leather straps, the bridle.
And this is the rein.
And this rope.
And the rope must be for tethering the animal.
It's just like it's brand new. It's still very flexible. It could take a lot of weight. The introduction of horseback riding to this region meant that the people had vastly increased mobility. That means that they could take advantage of more distant pastures. They could move their yurts, their houses to farther away. That means the pastures that they could utilize were vastly extended.
To survive the bitter winters high up in the mountains, the nomads relied on extremely well-insulated but portable homes called yurts.
This is the flap that covers the door of the yurt, and it's done with felt, and it's quilted to make it much firmer, because the felt otherwise, with all wear and tear, would pull apart. And then it's edged with a nice braided wool edging. And down at the bottom is this nice woven band. It goes around the complete circumference to hold the felt in place. We've seen all of these techniques in the mummies. We've seen the braided bands, we've seen the quilted band, and the felt. All of this was influenced from the nomadic people down to the lowland sedentary people.
The yurt and its occupants' way of life have changed little in 2,000 years.
I'm interested to know what kind of diet they have. What do they have in their normal diet?
Very, almost no vegetables, mostly milk products.
And we see some of them on the table here, don't we? Yeah.
And some meat, a bit of meat.
There's their diet very...
Charlotte learns that this family of nomads exchanges meat and wool for grain, which they add to their own food products. Without this carbohydrate supplement, they would suffer from crippling malnutrition. If the ancient nomad population was healthy, they too must have traded with outsiders for grain.
They don't have many illnesses. They just big flus, colds, that sort of thing. They have 500 sheep and goats, 500 sheep, 100 cows, cattle, and 80 horses.
But exactly who were the nomads? And where did they come from? Archaeologist Lou Nguyen suggests they try to locate a mysterious site dating from the time of the ancient nomads. Perhaps it will yield some clues.
Oh, God, amazing. Look at that.
Oh, look at those.
A colossal rock face, covered with elaborate engravings.
This mountain is the perfect setting for a reproductive fertility rite ceremony. There's a lot of grass here, it's very lush, and the mountain itself is so grand that it's natural that people would want to come here and have ceremonies.
I see females performing a very ritual dance, and some of them even falling into ecstasy during the dance time. And the copulation between the male and the female are prominent in these scenes.
These 3,000-year-old dancing women with their narrow waists and stylized gestures are nearly identical to figures found in Bulgaria and in the Ukraine, dated to about 1,000 years earlier. There, too, the dancers celebrate fertility and reproduction. These figures have large noses, long faces, and round eyes. The nomads are thought to have Iranian origins. Here, their Western roots are literally carved in stone. Eager to establish if the nomads traded for grain with the mummy people, Charlotte and Lou try to figure out how well the ancient herdsmen ate by studying their skeletal remains.
In a healthy human body, this bit of the pelvis should be separate from the sacrum and able to move freely. But this half is fused.
I suspect this is probably due to injury. And again, this may well be related to their lifestyle, maybe to horse riding. On the back of the mandible, you'll see a very large hole there, which indicates that the bone has got infected inside. The pressure's built up, and it's forced it with the pus that's formed inside the bone. Exposes the pulp cavity, the centre of the tooth, which you can see there. An infection gets into the roots of the teeth and causes destruction of the bone. Suggested this is associated with walking up and down steep mountainsides, being in the hills a lot. I don't see much evidence in the nomadic skeletons I've looked at of nutritional deficiencies, so therefore they must have been getting additions to their main part of the diet from a source, and that's probably from the agriculturalists, and they would have been trading their animals for things like grain, fruit and vegetables.
It now seems certain that the nomads bartered with the mummy people for food. But it turns out they became far more enterprising, wide-ranging traders. Their graves contain such items as a 3,000-year-old makeup stick and numerous bronze objects made hundreds of miles away.
We have evidence of long-distance trade across the mountains and steppes. So we have bronze knives, which show a very strong affinity with the steppe nomads on the northern side of the Tian Shan and clear as far north as southern Siberia.
At the time bronze was spreading eastward, the Chinese recorded their first descriptions of European-looking nomads.
They say that they had red hair, bluish green eyes, and they looked like monkeys, and long noses. They had long noses, and they looked like monkeys. Hairy all over.
A bow and some arrows.
Later nomad finds include artifacts that were not intended for sale.
You could still use this.
These swift riders became masters of archery, ready to trade in violence when it suited their interests.
Very powerful.
Before long, the threat of their powerful serpentine bows would profoundly affect the course of Chinese history.
There are several kinds of arrows. This one has an iron
The bow was found during Lu's most recent excavations, which have yielded many spectacular finds dating to about 300 BC. They are kept in a locked storeroom, and until now have never been filmed by outsiders. One of the most important discoveries is a fully clothed woman wearing a conical hat, symbolic of a high priestess of the nomads. It would one day become the hallmark of witches in Europe. Most startling of all is a male mummy, bearing marks unlike any seen before. The man's chest had been incised, possibly due to lung disease, then sewn up with horsehair sutures. By this time, the distinction between farmers and nomads was blurring.
They lived in tents, they followed the grasses and waters, they had considerable knowledge of agriculture, they owned cattle, horses, camels, sheep, and goats. They were proficient with bows and arrows. They seemed to be both nomadic and agriculturalist at the same time. So I believe that they were able to adapt to different kind of circumstances, and that those who found themselves in oases, for example, became farmers. And those who were in upper pastures or in grasslands either maintained a nomadic lifestyle or they became nomads.
Up in the high mountains, the nomadic population expanded rapidly and soon reached the Chinese frontier. Trading directly with the Chinese, they fell in love with their superb silks. To this day, dearly prized by the region's nomadic Cossacks.
The nomads had extensive trade networks from about 1000 BC, but the trade in silk began around 300 BC and spread right across the steppes to Central Asia, to Persia, and to Europe. This was the luxury item they really coveted.
If the Chinese refused to supply them, the nomads bargained even harder. Waves of horsemen laying waste to border towns. The Chinese cavalry was not powerful enough to chase them. But they did have superb engineers. The Great Wall of China was linked up in the 3rd century BC from sections that had been built earlier. It was not yet the wall we see today, but it was large enough to impress the nomads. Along the emerging Silk Road, the Chinese erected watchtowers to warn travelers if marauding nomads approached. In time, cities sprang up along the road. But who built them? Victor believes that at least one city, Jiaohe, may have originally been founded by the ancestors of the Tocharians, a mysterious people possibly descended from the ancient mummies. In fact, the European-looking bodies recently discovered by Liu lived near Jiaohe and date to about 300 BC, when the town was first settled. Victor's research shows that Tocharians were living here as early as the 3rd century BC. Several hundred years later, when ethnic Chinese first arrived, most of the inhabitants were still Tocharian. Who were these enigmatic people? If Victor can corroborate his hunch that they descended from the ancient mummy people, a startling conclusion would be inescapable. This region on the very doorstep of ancient China was continuously populated by people of European origin from as early as 1800 BC through the boom days of the Silk Road. The team requests permission to visit a remote site never before filmed by foreigners. There, they may be able to glimpse the real faces of the Tocharians. This temple complex, carved out of sandstone cliffs, is riddled with caves where Buddhist monks made their homes.
Wow, how nice.
It's very small.
Beautiful color.
Very small. It's 7th century.
7th century.
The walls of the caves are like mirrors, indelibly reflecting the different peoples who passed through the temple. Could they provide clues to the appearance of the Tocharians?
Yeah, with the fleshy face, right?
And look up there. You see somebody in a coffin.
Uh-huh.
You can see the musculature coming out.
And it looks to me like they're lowering the coffin into the burial. See the ropes around it, the green ropes, and they're putting it down into the burial.
The clothes they were wearing are the clothes of the local people here in Kucha at the time, and it's similar to the Iranian clothes of that period.
Oh look, up there, see the guy with the horse and the pointed hat? There's 3 of them on that horse. There's 3 Saka there with the pointed hats. 3 Saka nomads.
Many of the faces on the walls have Indian characteristics and caste marks. Others are plainly Europeans, painted in the style of classical Greece and Rome. There are also mounted warriors wearing trousers and boots, their bow cases slung over their saddles.
I would also like to point out the recurved bow on this individual kneeling up here. I think that's fascinating. We see a hunting scene of a man with a recurved bow shooting.
In the gloomy recesses of one of the caves, the scholars find a crucial clue to the identity of the Tocharians. Not a painting, but script. Amazingly, the Tocharian tongue is more closely related to the languages of Western Europe, with their Indo-European origin, than to those of Asia.
I think this is saying Suvarna Pushpa, which would mean gold flower, the name of the king.
More than likely, the speakers of this Western tongue were of Western provenance themselves. The puzzle is coming together. Tartan textiles, European faces, shared ritual practices, and now a close affiliation with European languages. They belong to a people related to those who lived in Eastern Europe in a region around the Urals and the Black Sea. Most of their common ancestors migrated west. The mummy people went east through the Russian steppes to the Taklamakan. But how long did they survive here? Were the Tocharians in fact their descendants? There's no way to be sure without seeing an authentic likeness of the Tocharians. The guide knows an isolated cave with portraits of the individuals who sponsored the cave building. It's a dangerous climb, more than 100 feet above the valley floor.
Isn't that something? Up the ladders and across that ledge?
A bit of a climb. Do you think it was well worth it? Now you've seen the...
Well, I would say so. There's some pretty impressive features in this cave. In this vaulted ceiling above us, we have a lot of Buddhas with kneeling figures beside them, and the kneeling figures look like they're Tocharians. So he's a local person, Tocharian, but wearing elements of costume.
In a small passage at the back of the cave, Victor hits pay dirt.
We see the red beard and red hair parted in the middle. It's a distinctive style of the Tocharians. He's wearing a coat with wide lapels on both sides and then folded over. It's a shame that these figures have all been defaced by people of other faiths at some time in the past. But it's still, it's very easy to see what they looked like, and we can tell who they were.
The Tocharian figures are strikingly similar to the mummies that lived in these parts 1,000 years earlier. Victor's quest has come full circle.
The wide lapel folded back. He's got the red beard, red hair parted in the middle. This Donner has blonde hair and a long nose and an Indian caste mark, which we call a tika. Mm-hmm. So he's a local person, a Tocharian, but wearing elements of costume that are Sasanian or Persian influenced, and has an Indian caste mark. So we see it's a combination of various traits which the Tocharians have adopted. By about the 10th century, the Tocharians had almost disappeared from the stage of history. We don't find any more documents written Tocharian, and also we don't have any references to them in historical texts after that period. I suspect that what happened to them is that they were primarily absorbed by the Turkic peoples who were moving into this area and replacing them. I believe that the legacy of the earliest inhabitants of the Tarim Basin survive in the current modern populations. We can sometimes see individuals with blonde hair, with light eyes, a very fair skin. And where did they come from? I think these are the vestiges of the ancient peoples. They now believe that they're Uyghurs or Tajiks or some other group, but in my estimation, these are just carrying on the old Tocharian influence.
A people long dead and neglected have emerged to reclaim their place in history and radically change our view of a critical time. Inhabitants of the Taklamakan Desert, ethnically European people, breached China's fabled isolation 1,000 years earlier than previously thought, laying the foundation for the Great Silk Road. The mummy people shaped the very future of civilization. The mummies are a unique and irreplaceable treasure. Though we now understand something of their role in history, scientific examination of their bodies will doubtless yield invaluable insights. But inadequate conservation imperils the mummy's condition. No one knows how long before these ancient mortals disintegrate and crumble into dust, anonymous and evanescent as the drifting sands.
This program or to find out more about NOVA, visit NOVA's website at pbs.org or America Online, keyword PBS. To order this show or any other NOVA program for $19.95 plus shipping and handling, call WGBH Boston Video at 1-800-255-9424.
Next time on NOVA.
If you're not in a safe room or basement, it's probably going to be history.
Can a daring new breed of storm chasers finally predict nature's deadliest phenomenon?
There's the tornado. Looks nice.
PBS presents NOVA, Hunt for the Super Twister.